Thank you very much, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. As Stefan said, yes, I came to the work I do from my work as a medical journalist working for the BBC and making many documentaries which I realized involved conflict of some kind. They were about patients and professionals, sometimes about disagreements between doctors and parents. And I thought there must be something more we could do to help to try and stop those situations from arising, or at least support parents and health professionals to manage those really complicated situations which arise. And I was reflecting last night, listening to all the wonderful speakers, and thinking, what is one of the consequences of not listening? And it's conflict. The importance of listening is really vital, and so often when I talk to parents, the very first thing they will say to me is, they're just not listening to me. And the health professionals will often say exactly the same thing. And we realize where conflicts begin from. It's that failure to communicate for whatever reason. So that's what I'm going to be talking a bit about this morning. Oh, there we go. Oh, how do you go back? Here we go. So I wanted to share some reflections with you about the work that my colleagues and I have been doing for the last 12 years. And in fact, the very first conference I spoke at was the UK Palliative Care Conference back in 2010. And our organisation, the Medical Mediation Foundation, came about as a result of a collaboration between a paediatric oncologist, Dr. Simon Meller, who very sadly died last year, who realised, as we kept in touch from when I'd been a journalist and making a film in which he played a very important part, we thought, let's try and do something together to see if we can make a difference and support conflict. So I wanted to start with this quote, and it comes from an American surgeon and writer called Atul Gawande, and some of you may have been familiar with his work. He says, I'm in a profession which has succeeded because of its ability to fix. If your problem is fixable, we know just what to do, but if it's not, and to me, that takes us right into the territory that we're talking about today. Health professionals so often say to me, you know, we feel confident when we can give information, when we can make things better, when we can offer solutions, but we feel much less in our comfort zone when there is high emotion, when the agenda is not ours, when we don't know what's going on. And so I hope by the end of this talk that you might feel there's a reason for thinking about conflict in a very productive, proactive way. It's inevitable in medicine, but the thing that makes the difference is how do we recognize it, how do we manage it? Whoop. There we go. So my work began back in 2010 with some funding from the Department of Health, and we did a piece of research interviewing doctors and health professionals, families, ethicists who'd been involved in conflict of one kind or another, and we were trying to unpick and understand what it was that caused these conflicts, what was the impact of them on everybody concerned. And we'd just finished that piece of work when I had a call from a doctor at the Evelina Children's Hospital in London who said, we have a case and I think mediation might help. And as a result of that case, we ran a pilot project at the Evelina for 3 years, offering mediation and training, and really all of our subsequent work has come from there, and we teach in a lot of different children's hospitals now in the UK and internationally too. And we learnt a lot from that very first piece of work. And one of our starting points was to say, what do we mean by conflict? So we started by asking just over 200 health professionals, how would you define a conflict? What are the factors involved? And these were the three that came up most frequently: the breakdown in communication, the impact on the care and the treatment of a child, and the impact on staff. And we often found that staff would be saying, please don't put me with that child today, not because there was conflict with the child, but because of the conflict with the family. And that would be the thing that was making them think this is a situation which is feeling very uncomfortable. But it often wasn't recognized, often wasn't acknowledged, because conflict is something none of us like. We tend to run away from it, we tend to avoid it, rather than recognize it and manage it. So then we started to ask, what were the causes? And we tracked as many conflict cases as we could for the same period of 3 months, over 2 years, and these were the top causes. Very important to say, cited by professionals. We haven't repeated the work with parents, but anecdotally, the causes that parents will cite and the way that they will talk about the causes is very, very similar. So communication breakdown, disagreements about treatment, what we call parents feeling they need to take control because for whatever reason they have lost trust or confidence and they're feeling out of control. And what the health professionals called unrealistic expectations. Parents wouldn't, of course, say that their expectations were unrealistic. So that's why it's important to say these are health professional cited causes. And I wanted to share some reflections from a doctor, from a nurse, from a parent, on what conflict feels like, what the impact of it is. So this is from a consultant pediatrician, and I kind of thought the slides were going to be bigger down there because I can't now read it. I'm going to have to turn around. You can develop a them and us. There's I really can't read it. You can read it. I can read the second one here. When she just says, I feel very sad when I find myself in those situations. I feel that somehow I've failed as a doctor to have averted it. It makes you really question whether you should be a doctor at all. Really powerful reflection. And for the nurse, it can mean that the child suffers. It doesn't become about the child anymore. It's all about the conflict and winning those little battles. The child's lying there in the bed, and it feels a bit like they've been forgotten. And we see that so often, that it's the child that becomes the victim of the conflict. And then a mother who's very powerful quote here, when there's no compassion, when there's no communication, when there's no empathy, when all these things are removed, what you see is a gap. What you see is a massive barrier, and when that barrier is there, nobody tends to listen to each other. It's all about war, war. It's a very strong quote, and some people might feel that the word war is inappropriate given what's going on around us, but I think after 12 years in this field, what I see very often and what I hear is parents and professionals describing these places as bit of an emotional war zone. It feels dreadful for both parents and professionals. So what can we do to try and put a shape around conflict? This pathway was the result of our initial piece of research back in 2010, and where we'd had very in-depth interviews with a selection of parents and professionals who'd been involved in conflict. And when those interviews were analysed, there was a really clear shape and pattern of escalation to the conflicts that they were talking about. So we've turned it into a traffic light pathway to make it kind of easy to grasp, but also to put a shape around it so that we hope to prompt that early recognition so that for health professionals, it becomes rather like recognizing and managing and identifying the symptoms and progression of a disease. If we can do the same thing with conflict, in a sense, it becomes less frightening because it's something we can see and hopefully we can manage as well. So in the green zone, we talk about the causes and triggers, and thinking back to some of the talks yesterday evening, the making assumptions. We often hear parents talked about and described as difficult parents. We try and reframe that and talk about difficult situations. And as minute you do that, it takes the sting, in a sense, out of that description. And we're then not judging the person, we're judging the situation which they find themselves in. In the amber zone here, where we have our little elephant, the reason that the elephant is there is because we often see when conflict escalates, everybody knows that something's not quite right, but it becomes, nobody's talking about it, nobody's acknowledging it. And so in this zone, where there's a real opportunity to row back and to de-escalate, what we often see is that uncomfortable feeling getting worse and worse, and nobody addressing the issue because they don't know how to do it, or because it feels so frightening. So we often see in that amber zone the sense of entrenchment arising as conflict begins to escalate. And in the red zone, very much reflecting back to who is the victim of the conflict in these circumstances. And it's so often the child. But we see in some of the extreme conflicts that we've experienced, they also involve physical and verbal threats, sometimes violence too. And at the extreme end of some of the cases, perhaps we think back in the UK to the Charlie Gard, the Alfie Evans cases, which involved threats to staff, which involved demonstrations outside hospitals. This is the place where if we think, where does conflict take us to? That's what it looks like, and that's where we don't want to get to. But I think at this point we have to say all of this stuff is complex. Modern medicine is complex, and the complexity is there every day, but disagreements do not have to become conflicts. And one of the ways that we step back from that and think about it is, there you go, to think about it as acknowledging different perspectives, to acknowledge that on the one hand, professionals are really wrestling with some of those ethical dilemmas created by the medical advances, and just leading them to question, well, just because we can do this, should we do it? Is it the right thing to do? And whereas we know from the research, the wonderful research that Myra Blue-Bonlanger has done, and you'll be hearing from later in the conference, parents feel that they must leave no stone unturned, even if the chances of a particular treatment being successful are vanishingly small. And that's complexity, of course, but it's what professionals grapple with every day. But so often what turns complexity into conflict is the nature of the communication between the parents and the professionals. And that's what our training is focused on. So we work with health professionals in short, either virtually or face-to-face, and the focus of that work is really on understanding and identifying conflict early and supporting them to step into the shoes of parents, of course, and patients. Of course, we can't step into the shoes completely of other people, but we can try and acknowledge their perspective and understand it and accept it, even if we don't agree with it. Very importantly, how do we manage ourselves in conflict? One of the reasons conflict escalates is because of the impact that it has and the feeling that somehow the battle has to be won, and we want to try and row back from that. So we do a lot of work on preparing for difficult conversations, on acknowledging the impact physically that conflict can have on you, as well as emotionally, and learning and practicing those very transferable skills that Anne Goldman was talking about last night, trying to use open questions, trying to avoid false reassurance, trying not to make assumptions, but being curious, exploring. One of my colleagues used a wonderful phrase. He used to say, explore before you explain. And I thought that was a very succinct way of summing up what we were doing. So we did some initial follow-up of our training after our work at the Evelina, and were quite encouraged by those initial results in the sense that such a large proportion of health professionals, even 6 months after the training, were saying that it had helped them to recognize the conflict and it had helped them to de-escalate it too. So that was a very initial study, but it was encouraging that this approach might at least be helpful. And this was some of the feedback that we had from the health professionals, and I particularly like that listening is listening beneath the words, and never assume anything until you have the full story. I think that was my own connection, really, between journalism and mediation, is that, of course, journalism is all about different stories and all the different sides to different stories. And it's just as applicable, I think, in the conflict situations that we're talking about. But what happens if all those skills don't work? What are the options for managing conflict? And there's another place to go to, there's another option to consider, and that's really the other side of our work, and it's mediation. And some of you might remember that in the judgment on the Charlie Gard case, Justice Francis said this: "It's my clear view that mediation should be attempted in all cases such as this one, even if all that it does is achieve a greater understanding by the parties of each other's positions." And that, in a sense, gave encouragement to people to try and use that approach, either alongside or as an alternative to going to court. So briefly, what is mediation? When people say, what do you do as a mediator? Actually, what I often say is I help people have conversations they might not otherwise be able to have. And that's a very important part of what we do. But essentially, it facilitates, in a safe and neutral space, parents and professionals to talk to each other, to try and find a way forward which they can accept. We're not talking about success in mediation, because so often in end-of-life scenarios, where the question and where the disagreement is about whether, for example, life-sustaining treatment should be withdrawn, of course there's never going to be a happy ending, but there can be a different ending to one which is going to court. There can be an ending where parents and professionals agree that they can't agree, and going to court is the best option that they can do, and that's okay. The important thing about mediation is it tries to repair those relationships that have become so damaged. So a mediator doesn't decide, we support. We don't make decisions, we don't tell people what to do. We support them to have that conversation. And crucially, it's voluntary. Nobody has to do it. It's confidential, and it's legally privileged. So even if they do end up going to court, what is said during a mediation cannot become any part of that court case. And that's important. Mediation allows space for the kind of things which actually a court wouldn't go near. A judge has to decide what is in the child's best interests. It doesn't decide what happened with your communication. Does anybody need to apologize? How does it feel to be in this situation? That is the sort of territory in which mediation can make a big difference. So just to give you an idea of what sort of cases mediation can help in. So, of course, when there's disagreement about treatment or care, and where there's disagreement about the care and treatment of a young person or adult without capacity, so these are cases which are decided if they go to court in our court of protection. When communication has broken down and the positions have become entrenched, as we saw in that amber zone of the pathway, and when the parties are not feeling heard or acknowledged or understood. And of course, as an alternative to going to court, but you can run the two processes alongside each other in parallel, and that often happens. So what have we learned about that? Asking for mediation early, not leaving it too late. It shouldn't be a tick box exercise. And mediation can be a process over time. Given the enormity and how high the stakes are in some of the cases, which involve potential death of a child, it can't be decided in a day. So sometimes mediation happens over a period of some weeks. And thinking about how second opinions are sought and how the parents can be involved with that, and in helping to ask the questions they really want to know the answers to in order to help them make this impossible decision. And just to share briefly some quotes from some of the people who've taken part in our recent cases. One of the nurses said, "It absolutely changed how we felt. It made me realize that this is a set of parents that are desperately wanting the best for their child. It made us reflect and see where communication could have been much, much better." And for the parent, there we go. We felt this was the first time with ourselves as parents and the medical team that we'd sat down and they listened to us and understood. When that happened, we let go. We were able to make the right decision and we were able to work together. And if we think about what are the benefits of mediation, just to be able to be in a position as a parent where you can feel that, feels like something positive which you might not get by going to court. The next phase of our work is very much thinking about how you embed these principles into clinical teams. And we're working on a project at the moment in 3 children's hospitals, supported by the True Colours Trust, which is working with clinical teams to embed these principles right from the top of the organisation throughout. And it came from working with a team who were involved in a case in Southampton involving a little boy whose parents took him away from the hospital to seek treatment for his brain cancer abroad. And what the hospital asked us to do was to create a pathway that they could turn to when conflict arose. So they would have steps to follow when it started to escalate. They said, we didn't know what to do next. So this is what our process involves. It's a whole spectrum from understanding, from communicating with parents differently at one end and using all the skills we've been talking about, to having a more formal process when conflict has escalated, which doesn't start from punishment or being being punitive in any way. It starts from a position of trying to understand, but acknowledging when, for whatever reason, things haven't worked and perhaps behaviours are feeling unacceptable. So that is the current phase of our work, and it feels like the logical place to go, that yes, it's important for individual professionals to be able to have the confidence to use their skills to manage those situations, but unless that's supported organisationally, the risk is that it doesn't, in situations especially which escalate, that it's not consistent, and that consistency of approach matters so much to parents. So we have piloted that framework in a number of hospitals with some initially promising results in the sense that it reduced the time taken to manage conflict and the economic costs, which of course funders always want to know about. It did, when we tried to work out actually what the cost of that reduced staff time would be, that was also significant, but that's what we're doing currently, to see whether that approach is consistent and those results are consistent over time. So, some closing thoughts. Conflict is something that can be recognised and managed, and rather than avoided. And professionals absolutely can be trained and given confidence to recognise and manage conflict, just as they would be trained to recognise and manage the symptoms of a disease. And the training can have a significant impact on the time spent and on the potential costs involved. And having that critical mass of staff trained is really important, supporting managing conflict as a team. And mediation can restore some of those damaged relationships between families and professionals and keep everybody's focus on the child, who is the person, after all, who matters most. So I'll end there. Please get in touch with us if you'd like to talk more about this work, but thank you so much for listening.